general questions. We turn now to First Minister's questions. Question number 1 from Jackson Carlaw.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The power to assert our position as an independent coastal state with full, unfettered access across our waters, or a plan to go back into the common fisheries policy with no controls at all. Which of these does the First Minister think is the best plan for our fishermen?
First Minister.
Well, what I think, Presiding Officer, is that the Tories raising fishing today is something of an early Christmas present in a political sense. Now, Jackson Carlaw's attack on me on fishing appears to be because I continue to support membership of the European Union. The strange thing about that attack is that so does Jackson Carlaw. And so does Ruth Davidson. Here's Ruth Davidson on the 1st of October 2018, just a few short weeks ago. Well, like I say, I voted to remain. I fought for remain. If there was another vote tomorrow, I would still vote remain. So on that issue, there is no difference, it would appear, between myself and the Scottish Conservatives. Where there is a difference is that SNP MPs on the 11th of December will vote against the Tory deal that sells out Scottish fishermen. Because we know that Tory pledges on fishing are not worth the paper they're written on. Let's have a look at them. The Tories said there would be annual negotiations rather than an overall agreement. The political declaration, though, commits to an overall agreement. The Tories said no link between access to waters and access to markets. The political declaration makes clear there will be such a link. And far from leaving the common fisheries policy behind, the EU statement makes clear that the new agreement will build on the common fisheries policy. Now, the Tories say, ignore all that, we'll get what we want at the end of the day. But the Tories have handed all of the leverage to the European Union, because unless the UK agrees to their rules in fishing, they will block a trade deal, and it takes just one country to do that. The truth of the matter is, and I'm delighted that Jackson Carlaw has given me the opportunity today to highlight this, the Tories, just as they did on the UK's way into the European Union, are selling out Scottish fishermen on the way out.
Jackson Carlaw.
What I actually gave the First Minister the opportunity to do was answer a question, but as is so often the case, it's clear that the First Minister reads out the answer to the question she would prefer was asked, rather than the question that is actually asked. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Fishermen's Federation has been absolutely clear. They say that under the Prime Minister's Brexit deal, the UK will be out of the CFP and that the UK will become an independent coastal state. More than this, they confirmed just yesterday in an email to every member of this chamber, their backing for the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement and the political declaration. That's their position. Is the First Minister seriously trying to tell us that she knows more about fish than the Scottish Fishermen's Federation?
First Minister.
Well, Jackson Carlaw wants to trade quotes. I'm happy to indulge him. Here's the Scottish Creel Fishermen's Federation. Well, I can only talk personally, having had these years behind me, and I really wouldn't trust the Tories as far as I could throw them. Whenever it comes to fishing, it's always been a sacrificial lamb. So is Jackson Carlaw saying that he knows more about fishing than the Scottish Creel Fishermen's Federation? The fact of the matter is, I know the Tories are desperate to spare their own blushes on this, but they are rewriting history. See, the commitment was never just... They don't like this, but they're going to hear it. The commitment was never just about being an independent coastal state. That's the bare minimum. What the Tories promised was annual negotiations. Now we know there's going to be an overall agreement. They promised no link between access to waters and access to markets. The political declaration makes clear that there will be that link. And of course, the statement issued by the European Union makes it clear that they are going to demand an arrangement that builds upon the common fisheries policy. So I say to Jackson Carlaw again, and no amount of bluff and bluster from him today will take away from this fact. The Scottish Tories, yet again, have sold out Scottish fishermen. Shame on them.
Jackson Carlaw.
Shame on you, concludes the First Minister. You know, if shame was a currency, the First Minister's pockets would be bursting. In fact, If shame was a currency, she might even be able to fill the black hole in her independence financial plans as well. Because what the First Minister is actually saying is she does know better than the Scottish Fishermen's Federation. And the reason the First Minister won't back the Scottish Fishermen's Federation position is because she can't. She's trapped by her own policy in Europe. The plain fact is that for all their posturing and pompous outrage, the SNP's policy is to rejoin the EU, and therefore, because there is no way round this, to rejoin the common fisheries policy. Here's what it says. Article 38.1 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union says that being a member of the European Union, as she wishes an independent Scotland to be, means you have to sign up to the common fisheries policy. There are no reviews, there is no reform. It's not a question of liking it, it's a question of lumping it. Isn't it simply deceiving people, First Minister, to pretend this is anything other than a fact?
First Minister.
I'm sorry, Jackson Carlaw really has to explain this a bit more simply to people, because he says that all of that flows from the fact that I want Scotland and indeed the UK to remain in the European Union. But again, I would say to him, so does he, or so he says. When Ruth Davidson says, if there was another vote tomorrow, I would still vote Remain, it seems to me that she wants Scotland still to be a member of the European Union. So if all of what Jackson Carlaw says flows from that, then it applies to Ruth Davidson as much as it applies to anybody else. Jackson Carlaw also talks about the Scottish Fishermen's Federation pledge and attacks me for somehow not signing it. The Prime Minister yesterday refused to sign the Scottish Fishermen's Federation pledge. But you see, we don't need to sign a pledge because we will do what matters. On the 11th of December, in that vote, on that deal that sells out Scottish fishermen, SNP MPs will vote against it. The question for Jackson Carlaw, are all these MPs that are going to sign that pledge, will they vote against that deal or not? Yes or no?
Jackson Carlaw.
The First Minister's advisers have given her a thick folder of answers to questions I haven't asked. I didn't mention any pledge to her. But since she asks, the Prime Minister did the deal that is going to deliver the pledge. So let's just sum up the SNP's position. They accuse Theresa May of selling out in fishing, but it's them who would drag us straight back into the CFP. They demand a renegotiation. With whom? The Chancellor of Germany, the Chancellor of Austria, the Prime Minister of France, the President of the EU, the President of the European Council, the EU's lead negotiator, the Taoiseach of the Republic of Ireland, and even Guy Verhofstadt, together with every other European leader, says this is it. This is the only deal on the table. They say, and I say, back a deal that delivers an orderly exit, protects jobs and delivers more control of our waters than we've had for half a century. She says, vote down the deal, meaning more chaos, more upheaval, and all in the hope that it will deliver her obsession with a second independence referendum. That's not in Scotland's interests. That is not standing up for Scotland.
First Minister.
You know, there's something starting to become very clear at First Minister's questions, and that is the redder Jackson Carlaw's face gets, the more he points wildly across the chamber, the more trouble he is in. You know, he asked me to support a deal that is bad for Scotland and bad for the UK, when the Prime Minister right now can't even persuade her own party to back that deal. That is the reality. Well, the SNP will continue to do what the SNP always does. We will stand up. We will stand up for Scotland. This deal will take Scotland out of the European Union against our will. It will take us out of the single market against our economic interests. It will put us at a potential competitive disadvantage with Northern Ireland, and into the bargain, it will sell out Scottish fishermen. And all along, yes, I have to say to Jackson Carlaw, who talks about the SNP using Brexit to advance the case for independence. Well, let me say to him, Brexit does that all by itself. It doesn't need any help from the SNP. And of course, that line, that threadbare line, is just a device for the Tories, because the opposite is true. They're exploiting independence to avoid hard questions on Brexit. It will not wash. People see right through it. And increasingly, they're seeing right through Jackson Carlaw and all of his Tory cronies as well.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Presiding Officer, this time last week, the First Minister stood up in this chamber and claimed that she had given a very fair settlement to local government. Today, the Accounts Commission reports that funding for councils was cut in real terms by £220 million in the last year. They also say that, and I quote, funding from the Scottish Government to local government decreased at a faster rate, 6.92%, than the Scottish Government revenue budget at 1.65%. That's taking Tory austerity and quadrupling it. First Minister, what's fair about that?
First Minister.
Well, the Accounts Commission report published this morning, as I'm sure Richard Leonard knows, is for financial year 2017-18. We're currently in financial year 2018-19, and in this financial year, the Finance Minister in the budget earlier this year delivered a real terms increase in local authority revenue budgets. That is ensuring that local government can protect frontline services, and of course he managed that against a backdrop of massive cuts to the Scottish Government budget imposed by the Tories at Westminster. Richard Leonard would have more credibility on these issues if he didn't continue to back a situation that allows Tory governments at Westminster to cut the budget of this Parliament.
Richard Leonard.
Well, let me go back to last week, because last week, at the same time as the First Minister was telling this chamber that councils get a fair deal, letters were being dispatched to parents across Falkirk from head teachers, warning them of unprecedented cuts, including cuts to support staff. Catherine Snedden of Bowness received one such letter. Her son Lewis is 10 years old. He has a learning disability and epilepsy. Yesterday, Catherine told me, year in, year out, we brace ourselves for cuts to his support network. Take that away from him and other children who need the ACN support packages, and our children decline in physical and mental health alongside their medical issues. First Minister, are you seriously saying to the Snedden family that this is fair?
First Minister.
Well, as Richard Leonard will be aware, or certainly should be aware, the leader of Falkirk Council has since issued a statement apologising for the misleading impression given by those letters and given assurances about education services in Falkirk. And I would hope that Richard Leonard would accept that and also indeed welcome that. In terms of education funding overall, he wanted to quote the Accounts Commission report at me earlier on. What he will read in that report, page 17 of it, and again, this is 2017-18, education expenditure increased by 3.2%, 1.5% in real terms. That was last year. In this year, local authorities have set education budgets that are 3.8% higher than the budgets they set in the previous year. That's a 2.3% real terms increase. And since the SNP came to office, total revenue spending on schools has risen by almost £500 million, which is over 10%. But just to go back to Falkirk briefly, and Richard Leonard might want to reflect on this point, one of the issues that Falkirk Council faces is the cost of Labour's schools' PFI schemes. Labour, Richard Leonard won't like to hear this, I know, but I think it's good that he does. In 1998, Labour signed a PFI deal for schools that had a capital value of £65 million, but the total cost to the taxpayer is going to be £314 million. That amounts to a cost to the taxpayer of £13.3 million a year. I think Labour should be apologising for that.
Richard Leonard.
Presiding Officer, the Audit Commission report says Scottish Government revenue funding to councils reduced by 2.3% in real terms in 2017-18. The financial outlook is for reductions in Scottish Government revenue funding to councils. And let's be clear about this, Falkirk is an SNP-run council. These council cuts are made by an SNP government in Edinburgh. And it has reached the point, where head teachers in schools across Falkirk are writing to parents to tell them that this so-called fair settlement means swingeing cuts. And the result is that vulnerable children like Lewis and families like the Sneddons face the stress of cuts to the services and the support that they need. First Minister, where is the fairness in that? Isn't Lewis entitled to realise his potential? Don't children like him deserve to receive the education that they need? When will you stop imposing austerity on Scotland's children and start investing instead on Scotland's local services?
First Minister.
Falkirk Council in this financial year set an education budget of £158 million. For Richard Leonard's information, that represented an increase of £8 million on the previous year. As I said earlier on, the Accounts Commission that he likes to quote at me when it suits him on education expenditure said in 2017-18 the expenditure had increased by 1.5% in real terms. We know that in this year spending on schools has increased and we know that under the SNP overall spending on schools in revenue terms has increased by 10.3%, and all of that in spite of the swingeing cuts being imposed on the Scottish Government's budget by Westminster. And again, I would say what I said earlier on. Richard Leonard would have more credibility on these issues if he didn't continue to support a situation where Tory governments at Westminster were allowed to impose cuts on the budget of this Parliament. When he changes his tune on that, people might be more prepared to listen to him on other matters.
A number of constituency supplementaries. The first from Shona Robertson.
Can I ask the First Minister whether she can update Parliament on progress being made in securing a future for Michelin in Dundee in the light of the recent meeting between Derek Mackay and the Michelin executives?
First Minister.
Well, can I thank Shona Robertson for raising this important question. The Scottish Government remains focused on securing the best positive outcome for the Michelin Dundee site and its workers. The Economy Secretary had a very productive meeting with Michelin senior executives last Friday, where we presented propositions relating to the future of the site and its workforce in Dundee. The Finance Secretary will convene the third meeting of the Michelin Dundee Action Group tomorrow morning, where he will update them on Michelin's response to the proposition and the next steps. Once the Action Group, including representatives of the workforce, have been informed of the outcome of these discussions, the Cabinet Secretary will, of course, update local members. We are working with trade unions, Dundee City Council, the UK Government and right across political parties, including with local MSPs, to achieve the best possible outcome for the Michelin site and all of its workers.
Annie Wells, to be followed by Anas Sarwar. Annie Wells.
Thank you. The closure of Cowlairs decontamination unit in Springburn has led to the cancellation of over 700 operations across hospitals in Glasgow, some of which have been major. In the papers this week, a whistleblower stated that had this closure occurred simultaneously with a large-scale incident, hospitals would not have been able to cope. The unit has reopened on a phased basis only, but can the First Minister assure me that patients will receive alternative arrangements as soon as possible and outline what action will be taken to prevent this situation from happening again?
First Minister.
Well, yes, I can give that assurance. Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board are already working hard to ensure that patients whose operations were cancelled as a result of this closure get alternative arrangements as quickly as possible. This was a very regrettable situation, but steps were taken as quickly as possible to rectify it. As the member said, Cowlairs is now open again. It opened again on Tuesday, and all appropriate steps will be taken to ensure that a situation like this is never allowed to recur.
And Anas Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, at a time when hate is on the rise, we got some hope. This week saw the Muslim and Jewish community come together to sign a landmark joint communique to call out and challenge Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in Scotland. Muslim and Jewish women born in Scotland together telling how they've been called traitors, been spat at, told to go home, and how they're scared of travelling on Scotland's public transport system. And this in the same week that we saw the horrific video of the young Syrian boy being racially abused and assaulted at his school in Huddersfield. Silence is no longer an option in the face of such hate. So does the First Minister agree that we can't leave the fight against Islamophobia to the Muslim community? that we can't leave the fight against anti-Semitism to the Jewish community, and actually that we can't leave the fight against all forms of prejudice and hate to any individual community, and that it must be a fight for all of us.
First Minister.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I would congratulate the Muslim and Jewish communities for the actions they have taken this week, and I would say that the actions of our Muslim and Jewish communities in doing what they have done this week are a better representation of Scotland than those who indulge in hate crime. I absolutely agree there is no place for silence. None of us should be bystanders when it comes to tackling and calling out hate crime. There's an obligation on all of us, and I say very clearly but very strongly that an attack on any Muslim, any Jew, any member of any minority community should be seen as an attack on all of us, and we should have solidarity and stand shoulder to shoulder at all time. And I say that as First Minister, and I hope I'm joined in that sentiment by every single member of the Chamber.
Question number 3, Willie Rennie.
I am concerned by the First Minister's plan to compromise with Theresa May. Cathy Newman from Channel 4 tweeted last night that the First Minister told her she'd back the Norway option if the Prime Minister put it on the table. But the Norway option takes us out of Europe. It gives us no say in Europe and will damage our economy. So can I plead with the First Minister not to wobble, to stand strong and oppose all and every kind of Brexit?
First Minister.
Well, sometimes I think Willie Rennie must have been asleep over the last 2 years when the rest of us have actually been battling on this issue. So let me set out for him again, and I'll try to do it in very simple terms, what my position is and what the position of the SNP and the Scottish Government is. Our preference, our strong overriding preference, is to stay members of the European Union. That's why, as I've said in this chamber to Willie Rennie previously, we will back a second vote to allow people to choose to stay in the European Union, and we very much hope that that proposition can command a majority in the House of Commons, and SNP MPs will be part of putting that majority together. But if it can't command a majority, and I hope it can, as we've said for the last 2 years, we would favour a compromise option of staying in the Single Market and Customs Union, because that's better than coming out of the Single Market and Customs Union and would be the least damaging option for our economy. It's not our first preference, but as a compromise, it is better than the alternatives that are on the table. So I hope that is crystal clear for Willie Rennie. And I would simply say to Willie Rennie, instead of constantly trying to attack the SNP on this issue, he might one day just think about lifting a finger to try to persuade Labour to back a second vote. Because if he can do that, then we will be able to put that majority together, and we can give people across the UK the opportunity to stay in the EU, and of course the people of Scotland the opportunity to express that preference for a second time.
Willie Rennie.
This is First Minister's questions, I want to remind her. So the First Minister is opposed to Brexit, but is prepared to back it too. Just yesterday, and this is important, just yesterday the Treasury told us that every kind of Brexit would damage the economy. So when jobs and businesses are at stake, I don't understand why the First Minister is prepared to accept this. The UK Government is on the ropes. Previous loyalists are opposing the Prime Minister. We finally have a chance of stopping Brexit. This is not the time to accept any new kind of Brexit. I was pleased that she told 700,000 people on the streets of London that she was committed to stopping Brexit dead in its tracks. So how could she look those people in the eye if she ends up backing any form of Brexit?
First Minister.
Do you know, I'll be corrected if I'm wrong here, but I don't think so. I'm sure I read in the newspapers the other day that there is actually a Liberal Democrat MP in the House of Commons who's going to vote for Theresa May's deal. There's not any SNP MPs going to do that. So let me try and make it. I fear that Willie Rennie is starting to make himself look just a little bit silly on this question. The SNP opposes Brexit. We want Scotland and the UK to remain in the EU. We will back a second vote to give people across the UK the opportunity to choose to stay in the EU. But if we can't persuade, or Willie Rennie can't persuade Labour to come behind that, and that simply cannot command a majority, I hope it can. But if it cannot, not for the want of trying on the part of the SNP or even on the part of Willie Rennie, then it would be irresponsible not to look at the next best compromise that protected jobs and the economy. So that is the position of the Scottish Government. It's the position of the SNP. The other thing that Willie Rennie never manages to explain, of course, is that how can he justify seeing Scotland taken out of the European Union against our will? Because if there is a second vote and we get the same result all over again, which of course we hope wouldn't happen, the fact of the matter is Scotland would be no better off. So the real question is, will Willie Rennie stand up in that second vote? If Scotland votes again to remain, will Willie Rennie back all options, including independence, to make sure that Scotland can remain in the EU?